I never imagined silence could feel so violent. The night my husband found out about my affair, he didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. He stood there holding my phone, staring at the screen like it had erased something inside him. When I finally admitted it was his friend, the man he trusted without question, he looked at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered into his life by mistake. "I don't want to hear anything," he said quietly. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't going to end with shouting or forgiveness. It was going to end with him choosing a version of his life where I no longer existed. People like to believe betrayal happens suddenly in a moment of weakness or temptation, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. It grows slowly in the quiet gaps between conversations, in the evenings where two people sit side by side yet feel miles apart. From the outside, our marriage looked calm and stable. We lived in a tidy house on a peaceful street, paid our bills on time, and attended family events like a couple who had everything under control. No one saw the emotional distance settling in like dust, unnoticed until it was everywhere. Callum was never careless with our life together. He believed love was shown through responsibility, through providing, through consistency. He worked long hours, planned ahead, and treated marriage like something that needed to be maintained properly. For years, I admired that about him. I felt safe knowing he was reliable. But over time, safety turned into quiet isolation. Our conversations became practical rather than personal. Our affection became routine rather than intentional. I would tell myself this was normal, that mature love wasn't supposed to feel intense, but deep down I felt myself shrinking, becoming less seen, less needed, less alive. I never set out to betray my husband. I didn't wake up one morning dissatisfied and decide to ruin everything we had built. What I did was much quieter and much worse. I stopped speaking honestly. I stopped asking for what I needed. I convinced myself that feeling lonely in a marriage was something you were supposed to endure rather than address. And in that silence, I became vulnerable in ways I didn't recognize until it was too late. Soren had been part of our lives for years. He wasn't a stranger or some sudden temptation that appeared out of nowhere. He was Callum's closest friend, someone I trusted completely because I believed his loyalty matched Callum's. He was present at birthdays, dinners, casual evenings where nothing felt risky or inappropriate. What made him dangerous wasn't attraction at first, it was attentiveness. He noticed when I seemed tired or withdrawn. He listened without trying to fix me. When he asked how I was, he waited for an honest answer instead of brushing past it. At first, I told myself there was nothing wrong with talking. People are allowed to have friends. People are allowed to feel understood. But slowly, those conversations became something I looked forward to more than the evenings spent with my own husband. I began sharing thoughts I should have shared with Callum. I began choosing emotional comfort over honesty. And without realizing it, I crossed a line that once crossed couldn't be undone. The affair didn't begin with passion or desire. It began with relief. Relief at being heard. Relief at feeling visible again. And once that door opened, it became harder and harder to convince myself it was still closed. I lived in a constant state of contradiction, telling myself I was still a loyal wife, while hiding a part of my heart from the man I had promised everything to. The night Callum found out, I knew immediately that something had shifted beyond repair. When he looked at me, there was no anger in his eyes, only disbelief in something far colder. I wanted to explain, not to excuse myself, but to tell him how we had arrived here together, how distance and silence had played their part. But he didn't want a story. He didn't want reasons. He wanted distance. When he walked away from me that night, choosing silence over confrontation, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't about being caught. This was about the fact that I had already lost him long before the truth came out. And whatever came next, I would be facing it alone, unheard and fully responsible for the damage I had caused. The days that followed didn't separate themselves into mornings and nights the way they used to. Everything blended into one long stretch of heaviness, as if time itself had slowed down to force me to feel every consequence of what I'd done. Callum didn't argue, didn't ask questions, didn't circle back for clarity. He simply removed himself from me in the quietest way possible. He moved into the spare room without discussion, without a dramatic announcement, as if it were the most logical adjustment in the world. Watching him carry his pillow down the hallway felt more final than any shouted accusation could have been. That was when I realized silence wasn't just his reaction, it was his decision. Living in the same house became unbearable in a way I hadn't expected. We shared space, but not presence. He passed me in the hallway without meeting my eyes. We ate at different times. The sounds of his routines, keys on the counter, the low hum of the shower, the closing of a door, felt distant, mechanical, like I was observing a stranger's life from inside my own home. I wanted to speak, to interrupt the silence, to force some kind of emotional response from him, but every attempt felt intrusive, almost disrespectful, as if he had drawn an invisible boundary around himself that I no longer had permission to cross. I tried once, early on. I asked if we could talk, not to argue, not to justify anything, just to explain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn fully toward me. He simply said, "There's nothing you can say that changes what you did." That sentence settled into me slowly, like a weight pressing deeper with each breath. I understood then that this wasn't about anger or punishment. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was protecting himself from further damage, and in doing so, he was closing the door on any version of us that required vulnerability. Soren's messages started coming more frequently after that, but they no longer felt comforting. They felt frantic. He wanted to know what Callum had said, whether he'd been confronted, whether things could still be fixed somehow. Reading his words made something in me recoil. The man who once felt like a refuge now felt like a reminder of how badly I'd misjudged everything. I stopped replying. Not out of cruelty, but because I couldn't carry his panic alongside my own guilt. The connection that once felt intense and validating now felt hollow, stripped of meaning the moment real consequences appeared. One evening, Callum finally spoke again, properly this time, and the calmness of his voice unsettled me more than anything else could have. He told me he had contacted a solicitor. He explained that he would be staying with a colleague for a few nights while arrangements were made. He spoke like someone outlining a plan, not like a man discussing the end of his marriage. I felt my chest tighten as I realized how far ahead he already was, how much thinking he had done while I'd been stuck replaying the same moment of discovery over and over again. I tried again then. I told him I wasn't asking for forgiveness. I told him I just wanted to be understood, that I needed him to hear how lonely I'd been, how disconnected we'd both become. He listened this time, but only until I finished speaking. Then he said something that changed the shape of the situation completely. "Understanding doesn't bring peace," he said. "Distance does." And with that, he made it clear that closure, at least the kind I wanted, wasn't something he was willing to offer. His sister reached out a few days later. She didn't accuse me or comfort me. She spoke carefully, like someone choosing words that couldn't be taken back. She told me Callum had always processed pain by withdrawing, by simplifying his life until nothing unexpected could reach him. Right now, she said, he needs control. Silence gives him that. Hearing it framed that way made something inside me collapse. I realized then that every attempt I made to explain myself only threatened the one thing he felt he still had. The guilt changed shape after that. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was constant, dull, inescapable. I began to understand that my need to be heard might never outweigh his need to feel safe again. And that was a truth I had to sit with, no matter how uncomfortable it became. I started preparing myself for a future where my side of the story remained unspoken, where the version of events that mattered most was the one he carried forward without me. But even as I began to accept that loss, I didn't yet understand how far Callum was willing to go to protect himself. His silence wasn't the end of his response. It was only the beginning. Because while I was still hoping for one honest conversation, he was already shaping a future that didn't include me at all. And the next step he took would make it impossible for me to pretend this was something we might recover from. The silence didn't break with a conversation. It broke with an action. I found out by accident, which somehow made it worse. Callum had left early that morning, earlier than usual, and for the first time in days I noticed something missing from the house. His spare room door was open, the bed stripped bare, the wardrobe empty. Not rearranged, emptied. That was when the weight in my chest shifted into something colder and more permanent. This wasn't space, this was departure. Later that afternoon, he came back only once, and only briefly. He didn't sit down. He didn't take off his coat. He stood near the door like someone visiting a place they no longer lived in, and told me he had signed a lease on a small flat near his work. Temporary, he said, until everything was finalized. The word finalized echoed in my head long after he'd said it, because it carried a certainty I hadn't allowed myself to accept until then. This wasn't a reaction. This was a decision that had already settled inside him. I asked him if there was truly nothing left to say, if 7 years together really ended without a single real conversation. He looked tired then, not angry, not cold, just exhausted in a way that felt deeper than lack of sleep. I've said everything I need to say to myself, he replied. Talking now would only reopen something I'm trying to close. And in that moment, I understood that what I wanted, mutual understanding, shared grief, a clean emotional ending, was something he no longer believed in. The confrontation I had imagined never came. There was no explosive argument, no confession scene where everything spilled out. Instead, the reality settled in quietly, like a verdict delivered without drama. He stopped asking where I was going. I stopped pretending there was a future we were both still part of. We began communicating only through short messages about practical things, paperwork, schedules, belongings. Our marriage was being dismantled efficiently, piece by piece, without room for emotion. Soren reached out again around that time, and for the first time, I felt nothing when I saw his name. No comfort, no longing, just a sharp clarity that surprised me. I met him once, not to relive anything, but to end it properly. I told him this wasn't love, that whatever we'd called connection had collapsed the moment it demanded accountability. He tried to explain himself, to soften what had happened with words about confusion and misplaced feelings, but I stopped him. I didn't need another explanation that led nowhere. Walking away from him felt less dramatic than I'd expected, but it also felt final in a way that mattered. What hurt most wasn't losing Soren, or even the marriage itself. It was realizing that Callum no longer saw me as someone worth engaging with emotionally. I had become a chapter he wanted to close without rereading. There were moments when I almost wished he would yell, accuse, break down, anything that would prove I still mattered enough to affect him. But he remained controlled, distant, resolute, and that restraint made everything irreversible. The real breaking point came the day the papers arrived. Seeing everything reduced to dates and signatures made it impossible to hide behind emotion anymore. This was the end, written in plain language. Callum didn't explain the terms or argue over details. He had already decided what he needed, and I could see that his priority wasn't fairness or revenge. It was peace, and he was willing to lose me completely to achieve it. When I signed my name, my hands shook, not because I didn't understand what I was doing, but because I finally did. This was the moment I stopped being his wife in every sense that mattered. I wanted to say something meaningful then, something that would stay with him, but nothing felt appropriate. Any attempt to express regret or insight felt selfish, like one last attempt to insert myself into a story he had already finished telling. After that, he stopped coming by altogether. No final goodbye, no closure conversation, just absence. And that absence forced me to face something I had avoided since the beginning. Consequences don't always come with drama. Sometimes they come with quiet finality, and you're left to sit with them alone. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the worst part was over. I didn't yet understand that Callum's final decision wasn't about leaving me behind. It was about redefining himself entirely. And the way he chose to do that would reshape everything I thought I knew about loss, responsibility, and what it really means to live with the aftermath of your own choices. Because the last thing he did wasn't about me at all. And when I finally realized that, it changed the way I saw everything. I didn't hear from Callum for weeks after that. No messages, no updates, no accidental encounters that could be mistaken for fate. At first, I kept expecting something, a question, a reaction, even anger delayed by time, but nothing came. And slowly, painfully, I understood that this wasn't neglect. It was intention. He had removed himself from my life so thoroughly that there was no space left for confusion. That kind of absence doesn't happen by accident. It's a decision repeated every single day. What finally reached me wasn't a message from him. It was news. A mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that Callum had taken a position abroad, a long-term project, Europe, a clean break, new city, new routine, no shared history waiting around corners. Hearing that felt different from everything else. It wasn't sharp pain or shock. It was clarity. For the first time, I saw the full shape of what he had done. He didn't just walk away from me. He rebuilt his life in a way that made returning impossible. And that was when it hit me. Callum wasn't running from the betrayal. He was choosing himself. There was something almost admirable about it, even as it hurt. He hadn't tried to win. He hadn't tried to punish. He had simply decided that his future didn't need my explanations, my remorse, or my voice. He chose peace over understanding, distance over closure. And in doing so, he forced me to face the one thing I'd been avoiding since the beginning, that my need to be heard didn't outweigh the damage I'd caused. I thought about all the moments I'd replayed in my head, all the conversations I wished we'd had, all the words I'd saved for a time that never came. And I realized something uncomfortable. Sometimes you don't get to tell your side of the story to the person you hurt. Sometimes the consequence is living with your truth alone. Soren faded from my life quietly after that. No dramatic ending, no lingering emotions, just distance. Whatever we had called connection didn't survive the reality of what it cost. In the end, it wasn't love or passion that remained. It was responsibility. And responsibility is heavy when you carry it without anyone to share it with. I stayed in the house for a while, surrounded by objects that no longer belonged to a shared life. Every room felt like a reminder of something unfinished. Eventually, I moved too. Not because I was starting over, but because staying felt like pretending nothing had changed. And everything had. I've had time since then. Time to sit with my choices without excuses. Time to understand that loneliness doesn't justify betrayal, and silence doesn't make someone less responsible. I don't tell this story to seek sympathy. I tell it because it's the truth. Because sometimes the most painful lessons don't come with confrontation or forgiveness. They come with quiet endings and unanswered words. Callum never spoke to me again. And as much as that once felt cruel, I now understand it was his way of surviving something that broke him deeply. He didn't owe me closure. He owed himself peace. And I've learned to live with that. Because the hardest part of losing someone isn't watching them leave. It's realizing they left strong enough to never look back. If this story hit hard, like, share, and subscribe for more real confessions and unforgettable moments.